This build's really flexible in the way you can build it, and it scales pretty well with currency. I have it currently set up as a more balanced character that maps insanely well while being decently bulky, that also happens to be able to do bosses. However, changes can be made to specialize it more for whatever playstyle you prefer. This was meant to be a mapping character, but after I started investing more, I found that bosses were just kinda dying too, the exception being the Uber bosses. The mapping on this character is some of the most fun I've had, but this build suffers from a little problem called, being melee. For a very straightforward hit-based melee build that locks you in place for optimal DPS, my current setup isn't tanky enough to be taking hits in Uber content. Not to say it's squishy, but you really want to be a bit tankier for this kind of playstyle in the Uber endgame. So unless you're really skilled at the Uber fights, you'll find that you end up dying a lot. I'll cover what changes you can do to make it a better Uber bosser, and even a budget setup and leveling tips. But for now, I really want to get into where this build shines. Mapping. Aside from hyper-specialized, dedicated bossers, I highly value a build's mapping ability, since that probably makes up the largest part of your gameplay. With this build, mapping is super smooth, since it's one of the few builds out there that can clear with its movement skill. Since all the shield skills scale the same way, our shield charge can be used to clear with like no investment. In fact, I'm currently only running a 3-link, with one of the links being power charge on crit just for charge generation. Your shield charge doesn't need to be juiced up, since most of our clear will come from the phys explosions, which is explained in my last video, so I'll link it in the description. But essentially, I'm just using an explodey chest and weapon in my endgame setup, and that's enough for the full screen explosions you're seeing. Now, if you do want to juice up your shield charge for even better clear, I'd put them in some gloves with insanity or horror for more speed or crit consistency. Now, even though shield charge probably gets more use in this build, I don't think I can call it a shield charge build because my 6th link is Shield Crush. It's a pretty generic melee AoE skill. It creates 3 cones where 2 of them can overlap, which is pretty much always with a little AoE investment. The interesting part is how it scales. It has some base flat damage, and you get additional flat damage that scales off of how much armor or evasion you have on your shield. You also get a bunch of crit chance and crit multi that scales off your shield's ES thanks to Divergent Shield Crush and Seething Fury. This unique jewel is a good place to get corrupted blood immunity since it's so cheap. By the way, I highly recommend Ashes of the Stars if you can afford it, since another 30 quality on Divergent Shield Crush gives us another 90% crit multi. The Reservation and +1 are also pretty useful in this build. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth in my items since the POB is there if you want it. Rather, here's a brief overview of some of the stuff you'll want. First off, I think I should give you context on how I'm building my character. Shield skills inherently have huge flat phys and crit, so we're taking that, converting all the damage to elementals so we can abuse brittle to cap our crit. We're converting to both cold and fire because I want to fit in Herald of Ash, and I swear it isn't only because of the aesthetics. By the way, we can also abuse Scorch and Trinity, which is really strong. I wanted a bunch of generic increased phys damage on an Elegant Hubris. That way, we could scale our phys explosion damage too. However, I couldn't get one, so instead, I'm scaling my percent increased damage with all spell damage and Crown of Eyes. Unfortunately, this doesn't do anything for explosions, but the elemental conversion and phys added as elemental scaling turned out to be good enough. Your shield is the most important piece, obviously. Get a 30% high base percentage Supreme Spiked Shield, and start throwing dense fossils at it. You want as much evasion and energy shield on it as possible, because that's how we do damage. Do try to get at least 300 energy shield, because that's a breakpoint for crit multi with Divergent Shield Crush. Next, most important part, explodey. You want, if not elevated, at least a well-rolled tier 1 explode mod on your chest, and a 15% implicit on your weapon. This weapon is just explodey and spell damage. Arcane Surge's more spell damage doesn't work for Crown of Eyes. It's only there because I happen to have the Arcane Surge AoE enchant on my belt. For bosses, you want to do a weapon swap into something like this for more damage. I have my shield charge in my weapon because I don't really need it for bosses, and I just swap my weapon out with my bossing sword, which has an ancestral totem set up in them already, so I don't have to micromanage my gems or skill bar. I just swap them out. Now, don't get too intimidated by this sword, it's not that hard to craft. I'll put how to craft this sword in the description. Now, in conjunction with the cold mastery, you want at least 60% phys converted to fire on your gloves. More if possible, to balance out how much more cold damage you're getting from hatred over Herald of Ash for Trinity. The other notable thing I'm using is Circle of Guilt, which just gives us a bunch of generic phys damage, which also scales our explosions. Other things you'll need are 100% spell suppression through gear and your tree if needed, 100% ailment avoid, one good accuracy roll, get resistances wherever you can. Chaos Res is a nice luxury, but it'll be harder to fit in without a Mage Blood, and at least 154 total int for Crown of Eyes. Honestly, I think the int here is probably one of the harder things to fit in, cause we're on the bottom of the tree. Don't be too afraid to take a 30 int passive. Once you have those things taken care of, get as much attack speed, AoE, and life as possible. By the way, we are a Scion because we can take advantage of the extremely efficient spot for Elegant Hubris and Impossible Escape here. For the price of 5 passive points and 2 jewel sockets, we get 240% spell damage, 80% melee phys damage, and 40% crit multi. For our Ascendancy, we take Slayer for the AoE and Overleech, and Raider for Frenzies, Onslaught, Spell Suppress, and Phasing. We're also using a Forbidden Flesh and Flame to yoink Saboteur. Now, it might sound super troll because we're not a trap build, but just look at it. It gives a lot of AoE, penetration, and chance to blind, which is actually a thing that helps us cap our hit chance. I mentioned earlier that this build was really flexible, and that's because you can change around a bunch of things depending on your budget and preferred playstyle. A good alternative to Ashes of the Stars is Leadership's Price. Just make sure you equalize your strength and dex, which shouldn't be too hard to do in this build. That frees up a jewel slot since you won't need the interrogation anymore. You can replace it with a rare or cluster jewel, or just put one of your other jewels in there and save some points. The max res on this can synergize really well with Melding of the Flesh. Remember, you only need one of the resistances to be rolled well. Honestly, I wish I had put Melding in this build. It would have been huge for making this better at uber bossing. If you don't have a Mage Blood and you're struggling with resistances, you can drop the Determination and instead run Purity of Elements. That also makes gearing easier since you don't have to worry about ailments. If you can get a nice Elegant Hubris with a lot of phys damage, you can drop Crown of Eyes and spell damage. If you want some more damage, you can anoint Panopticon, or if you're able to get a second curse in, you can run Elemental Weakness. If you need more AoE, you can get more on a medium cluster. If you have enough AoE, you can instead yoink Inquisitor from the Forbidden Jewels for more damage. If you have a lot of currency and have trouble getting enough int for Crown of Eyes, you can just allocate either Saboteur or Inquisitor normally for more int, and use the Forbidden Jewels to take Raider. If you're not using Mage Blood and don't need Raider, then Pathfinder is also a good option. In fact, I use it in my budget setup. For the budget setup, you want to go non-crit Impale. This build is also good at lower levels since the endgame one really shines once you get into the mid-90s. We go full phys Impale because you get to use the Pride Sublime Vision that gives you 25% explodey. With a weapon implicit and a basic explodey chest, mapping will be a breeze and you can quickly get some levels and currency. Since the explosions are carrying your mapping and they scale off monster life, you can start doing high tier maps as soon as you get your explodey online. I think I was doing T16s at like level 70. Oh, by the way, just so you know, I'm not over exaggerating, all the footage from the last few minutes have been from the budget setup at a low level. Leveling is super simple and feels almost as good as Hollow Palm. Other than a few key uniques, use whatever leveling items you want. You'll start off using Shield Crush at level 1. Feel free to use a random transmuted armor or evasion shield. At level 10, equip the Princess. You can usually pretty easily find these with good implicits like Onslaught and Resolute Technique. This will be your weapon until maps. Pick up upgrades off the ground until level 16 and then put on Cultin Halt. Once you get this fire conversion mastery, put on Hrim Sorrow and you can start using Trinity. With Hatred and Herald of Ash and added fire support on your Shield Crush, you should be able to maintain your Trinity stacks. Upgrade your shield to Mute Wind Pennant at level 42 and throw in an Intimidating Cry or Enduring Cry on your left click. At level 60, swap to Mistwall, and level 67 swap to Dawnbreaker, which will be your endgame shield until you go crit. Make sure you get a Dawnbreaker with a good armor roll. So yeah, even on a budget, this is probably one of the best mappers I've played. Its playstyle is somewhat reminiscent of the old Cosprey's Discharge build where you're just shield charging around everywhere, blowing up the whole screen. I highly recommend trying something like this at least once if you've never played with explosions before. It's so incredibly satisfying.